Hey guys, welcome back to Cult of Film. Before we start the episode today, I want to issue a correction from last episode in which I said that the great composer Joe Hisaishi, who composed for many great Japanese films and also for a lot of Studio Ghibli films, had passed away, and he is alive and well. So my apologies for that. I was actually thinking about um, the late great Ryuichi Sakamoto, who was I was a big fan of, and so just want to make that correction. Joe Hisaishi, alive and well, still with us. Ryuichi Sakamoto was the composer that passed. So apologies. And I guess to get started this episode, the movie that we're talking about today, my film homie over here, Truman, recommended. It is a 1985 Paul Schrader film about the sort of I guess, about the life of Yukio Mishima, who was one of Japan's greatest novelists. He was also a playwright, a sort of, I guess, novice samurai, just a really interesting sort of Renaissance man. And I had never even knew about this film. I studied a bit of Mishima in college. So when Truman said, "Hey, have you seen Mishima?" and I thought it was just a Japanese film, but no, written and directed by Paul Schrader. And I guess we'll let me hand it over to Truman, who again he was the one who thought this would be something we should check out. So Truman, take it away, man.
Yeah, well, the reason I first recommended this movie, well, there were a number of reasons, but it was because Kyle's such a big fan of cat people, and there's a lot of sort of cat people in terms of the set design and the characters that uh, is in Mishima, and I think, yeah, one of the first things about Mishima that really stands out for me, when I was recommending it and kind of pitching it to Kyle was like, oh, the set design is fantastic. And
Mm-hmm.
this really is, it has this like really beautiful stylized sets that, have this otherworldly feeling to them that really, it's very unique. It's the kind of thing anytime I see that style of very kind of evocative and surreal set design in a film, it's something that I always really like. And this movie really does it well. But it tells the story, and I guess we'll have to get into somewhat. I don't know if it's necessarily considered spoilers here, given that this is, like a historical person. But
Right.
I'll avoid it. I'll do my best to avoid it for now. But it essentially it details the story of Yukio Mishima, who's this kind of polarizing figure in Japanese literature, throughout the post-war period up until like the late 70s. Um, and it kind of gets into all these different complexities in his life and the ways that not only that there's a lot of strange contradictions in his life and the way that he is this fairly sensitive writer and poet, and also, a homosexual. But at the same time, he advocates for this very like far right wing kind of samurai-esque sort of like fascist um, style of government and philosophy.
He
Uh,
wanted to basically reinstate the emperor as the sole ruler of Japan. So yeah, very much a pro-authoritarian type of politics.
yeah, and that those contradictions existed throughout Yukio Mishima's life, and that's really sort of like the meat and potatoes of this film. And one of the other things that I love so much about it, it's not just the really elaborate and really colorful and beautiful sets. Um, Thematically, it really gets into a lot of these notions about sort of the essence of creating art. This idea that if you are within a if you look at a writer's work, you can come to understand a lot about them on a personal level. And the film juxtaposes both what is happening in Mishima's life with directly with his writing, and it uses that to kind of make a broader point of like the line between the characters Mishima's writing in his stories and who he was in the past are really blurred, and there's the notion
Mm-hmm.
that Well, I've always kind of maintained something that I'll see a lot when reading scripts that other people have written is there's a tendency, particularly among kind of amateur screenwriters, to write characters which are fairly transparently like self-inserts. You know, it's fairly common for me to read a script.
What? You said
uh,
that are self what?
Self-inserts, you know, where you read something and you go like, oh, this is the person writing themselves as a character. uh,
Mm.
and it's not necessarily a flaw per se. There's nothing wrong with having a self-insert character, but it's something that you see a lot with more amateur scripts, you know, where you read it and it feels fairly transparent. And I've kind of always maintained that it's sort of the mark of an experienced writer to be able to write a character that is not themselves, you know, someone who is fundamentally different and, you know, feels about the world, the way they feel about the world and the perspective is different from that of the writer. And that's something that I've always worked on within my own my own writing, and somehow I feel like I can never really do it. Anytime I'll be 80%, 90% done with the script and I'll look it over and I'll just go like, ah, shit, like this is still just me, you know, to some degree.
Well, here's the thing.
Yeah.
You know, not to get too far away from the film, but I think with regard to screenwriting, I try not to put any sort of those strictures. That's somebody's opinion that you can't write yourself into a movie. I mean, so much of the people that I respect, you know, we were discussing last night. Let's take Andrei Tarkovsky and Rainer Werner Fassbender. Those are two guys that wrote so much of themselves into their films, and I wouldn't consider either one of them amateur. What
Oh,
I think works for them is that they're incredibly interesting men and incredibly interesting people with a really strong interest in the world and existence, and they pour all of that in. So I do think that maybe that criticism is valid if you are, you know, if you're 21 years old and you have no life experience and everything you know is based on the opinions you've absorbed as opposed to actually engaging the world, yeah, it's probably going to suck. But if
yeah.
you are in any way, you know, someone who is again engaged the world, you're interesting. You've explored ideas and that I think it can be a different thing. But don't beat yourself up because you put a lot of yourself into a character. You can only write what you know. I
Yeah.
think so. You know, that I would just that's just my counter to that. So
Yeah, and there's the yeah, and I don't think it's apparently bad, and you know, and that's sort of like what we see within this movie specifically is this notion that we what Mishima is writing directly parallels his life, and you know that they kind of act as this sort of precursor to sort of the course of his life and the things he will go on to do, which also are portrayed in the movie. But yeah, there's I think the idea that kind of no matter what, you can sort of come to understand a person through their writing, in a kind of very meta sense is kind of big picture what this movie is about. And I think we get a very clear. It does a really great job of drawing these parallels between Nishima's writing and his life, and sort of all leading up to this kind of one singular point at the climax of the film. And I really love it for that.
yeah, I appreciated it. I was really surprised. If you hadn't told me, if I didn't see the credits, if I had never seen anything about who directed this movie,
Yeah,
I never would have guessed that it was Paul Schrader. And I don't mean that as an insult. I just mean it just felt like such a Japanese film. And that's probably because the script was translated and sort of the Japanese adapted through Schrader's brother, Leonard, had a Japanese wife, Chieko, who worked, you know, shoulder to shoulder with the two of them to make it authentically Japanese, as opposed to it seeming like, oh, here's a Westerner trying to write a movie and direct a movie about one of our greatest novelists. So they did. It seems like they did a very good job of that. I really also appreciate, to your point, of how aesthetic and visual this movie is, which also really sort of layers in to um, the Japanese sort of Japanese films, of course, being Japanese, are often very aesthetic. They can be very minimalist, per some Akira Kurosawa films, or very sort of garish and bold, like some Akira Kurosawa films. But it really made me think of all the set pieces. Instead of like characters having like a conversation with some women along a river, they just built a set that was super bright and super interesting. So it's very stylized and almost, uh, I guess it would be expressionist would be the term. And there were just so many scenes like that that at first you're like, okay, you know, if you don't know how to watch that type of a film, that might throw you. But I was gripped by it. The to encapsulate that art of set building and background painting really evoked all of the Japanese films from the 70s that I enjoyed, whether it be stuff like Lady Snowblood or Female Prisoner Scorpion, the Lone Wolf and Cub series. But I
Yeah.
appreciated that he incorporated that in. And then it also, it sort of reinforced the brilliance of Tarantino's work in Kill Bill, where
Mhm.
he built a bunch of sets, did a bunch of miniatures as well. So really just completely being absorbed in the Japanese aesthetic and sort of the Japanese craft and approach to filmmaking. I feel like Schrader just knocked it out of the park in this movie.
Yeah, absolutely. Tokyo Drifter is another one that I would call out too, aesthetically speaking. And I
Mm.
think, yeah, for me, everything. This is one of those movies where just kind of everything about it aesthetically really works for me. The score in particular, from Philip
Mm.
Glass, I really love. I can be somewhat kind of hit or miss with Philip Glass, but
Mm.
in this specific instance, yeah, something about the theme and the way there's the main theme of it, and there's a couple of different renditions of it with different instrumentation based off of sort of the portion of the film that we're in, and they have this like each has this very distinct kind of sound, and it uses the instrumentation to sort of differentiate the feeling of the film is split into four different arcs, and the instrumentation really helps differentiate those four different arcs. And the whole thing, it just provides a much richer and really engaging film. And I think, I like movies that have these sort of big climaxes, and this one does.
Mm.
Something like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is, I think, the gold standard of, a film leading up to this enormous musical climax. And I think this
Right.
had sort of same type of structure, where we've had these kind of different we've had this theme kind of coming in and out throughout the entire film, and then it crescendos for this like one huge moment, not only in the movie but in Mishima's life too. And it's part of that, alongside the set design, are two of like really the main things that stick with me, now that
And the,
especially.
the characterization really stuck out for me too. Is again, I read a bit of Mishima and about Mishima in school, and I really appreciated that they tried really hard to show all of the different facets of who Mishima was, because it could have been so easy. Like again, you've mentioned a couple of times that it's hard for you to wrap your head around how he could have held seemingly contradictory positions in his head so easily. And I do think it's something to, because I think we associate, for example, we associate right wing politics with capitalism, but he was against capitalism, or at least he said he was against capitalism. What he was really against was what he saw as sort of empty consumerism and sort of materialism. He was very much a mystic in that sense. And there's different types of right wingers. You've got like sort of the religious ones that are anti-materialism, kind of anti the world, and then you have, or used to have, fiscal and sort of business conservatives that were pro-free markets,
Yeah.
and so on. But I think someone coming from a Western viewpoint could look at Misha and be like, why, this guy's clearly a quote unquote conservative. Why is he decrying capitalism? And
Mhm.
I don't think it was in the sense that we understand it. He was basically sort of the ultimate sort of paleo conservative in trying. He wanted to literally turn the clock back for Japan, back to almost a feudal time, where you had samurai walking around, where the emperor's word was law, and it really, this is what I think is so tragic about his character is, and when I don't mean just character in the film, who he was, that he seemed completely oblivious to the idea that maybe the nation wasn't going to go for that. He was so absorbed with kind of his own clique of people, of followers that he created, that it didn't seem to occur to him that no, man, it's post World War. It was us being closed off to the West that built the culture that it led to World War II, and it resulted in us getting nuked twice. We're done with this, and that seemed to come as a genuine surprise to him. And so, again, brilliant guy, but such a sort of fatalistic, uh, ultimate old school type of approach. I think that he kind of had to culture. And so, while I can respect him aesthetically, I appreciate his appreciation for art. He seems to have a really antagonistic relationship to art. He really doesn't seem to acknowledge any of the great aspects of what modern Japan became. I watched some of these scenes, and I think back to some of his writings that I wrote, and it's as if he's unaware of that he's living in one of the most technologically advanced and aesthetically beautiful countries on the face of the earth. And so, in that respect, I get annoyed with him again as
Yeah.
a person, but they did a beautiful job of this folding. Again, a sensitive artist, poet, and writer. At the same time, he is this, he is a swordsman, and he's a bodybuilder, and he is trying to navigate the world as a homosexual man, and ends up marrying and having children,
Mm.
and but at the same time is very much has built sort of like this troop, clique, clan around him of men, and he even had access to training in military camps and things like that, and basically boot camp for his group. That's how big this guy was, how incredibly powerful he was, and revered he was in Japan, that the military would just let him and his men show up and just train. So he's a really, really interesting figure, and the likes of which I not that I would want to see his like again, but I like that there are these really interesting people in history and in the world, in a time where we're in the social media age, where it seems like so much of that uniqueness is kind of ground down or isn't as encouraged. I don't know. Maybe that's just me, but they did a hell of a job with the characterization and really being fair to him. It didn't seem like that they tried to take a position or were judging him. It seemed like, based on what I know of him and what I've read of him in his history, they did a really beautiful job of this kind of like, okay, this is kind of what happened. And his willing to engage, what I guess was considered in Japan the left. He would have debates with people that were more progressive, and so forth. And yeah, just respect to this guy. As much as I might disagree with him, he was an interesting figure, and they really do a great job of capturing that in this film. You really sympathize for this guy who trying to to be someone like him in that type of a culture, at least on the level of maybe artistry and his sexual orientation, had to be tough. And he did, I guess, the best that he could. But again, interesting. I'll quit talking now.
Yeah, and in that respect, I think um, it kind of makes sense that Paul Schrader would make this film, because a lot of these notions are things which Paul Schrader throughout his work has really focused on. The obvious stuff: Taxi Driver and Rolling Thunder, um, and Raging Bull, and all that. There's a number of movies. A lot of his characters, and Cat People as well, tends to focus on these kind of people who are sort of isolated from typical mainstream society, who feel very
Hmm.
lonely and out of place. Like there's the line from Taxi Driver. Travis Bickle says, like loneliness has followed me throughout my entire life. I'm God's lonely man. And I think that
Hmm.
note something is kind of one of the key ideas of all of Schrader's work, and it's something that I personally really like about it. If you look at also like First Reform and Card Counter, it's these people who have this very severe angst about society and themselves. And Mishima is no different. You know, he has these really great, notions about what Japan should be and who he should be.
Right.
And there's this, like you said, that fatalistic sense that he wants to destroy himself when he is young enough to still be beautiful forever, and
Right.
and that's something which exists within Taxi Driver as well, and Raging Bull.
Mhm.
This
No,
fatalistic, yeah,
no, it's an excellent point that Schrader does a really great job of capturing what it's like to feel alone, to not fit into the what contemporary society maybe expects of us or what we think it expects of us. But he does it in a way that, even with Taxi Driver, it could have
yeah,
been so easy to write Travis Bickle as sort of this two-dimensional character, this incel who just doesn't fit in, might have a screw loose, and just watching him go on a rampage. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that with Mishima. He takes care to remind us, oh wait, Travis Bickle, Mishima, the Ethan Hawke character from First Reform. These are all human beings that are facing some sense of existential crisis. That they have feelings, they have hopes, they have dreams, they have, concerns. And that's one of the beauties of Schrader's work. He doesn't ever just phone it in. Yeah, this guy is a screw up, or he's weird, so he's bad. He does a really great job of showing us a complete human being, and doesn't try to pull punches. It's like, yeah, you might not like this. This might make you uncomfortable, but there are people out there that are really just trying to figure themselves out, and he does a great job with that in his characterization and his writing and his work.
yeah, and that sympathy, I think, is something that is so critical, and it helps elevate Mishima, specifically the movie, beyond just feeling like this kind of exploitative thing. We're not gawking at Mishima in the way that at the end of the movie, Mishima gives this like really big speech that people don't really listen to and largely ignore, and it doesn't have the effect that he hopes it would have, and that's crushing. But we're right there with him in understanding why it is crushing to not be heard in that way, rather than being on the outside of that as the people who kind of hear what he's saying but don't really listen and largely ignore and kind of laugh and go, oh, he was this crazy guy who tried to stage a coup and
Right.
then killed himself. It's we the film does a great job, as with much of the rest of Paul Schrader's work. It does a great job of allowing us to understand how a fairly rational and a rational but idiosyncratic kind of person can be led to this extreme outburst of violence. And we
Right.
go through. Schrader's films are very good at putting us inside the internal mental state of these people and allowing us to sympathize with them, to the point where, when Travis Bickle and Ethan Hawke's character in First Reformed, and Mishima and this ultimately have this kind of desire to go out in a blaze of glory, it makes sense to us. We don't look at this and say how and why, and no one would have seen this coming. We're right there with him, and we go, oh, this actually,
And
you
certainly anybody who is familiar with who he is and knows his history,
know,
knows what's coming. It's kind of like, not that we're spoiling anything here, but if you know who he is, you should know where it goes, along the lines of, how would, Lincoln end, we kind of know. So it's still a movie worth watching, even though it has, it's not, a great resolution for him.
yeah,
One thing I noticed too that I'm really kind of surprised, I shouldn't say surprised again, because it's Paul Schrader and he's a sophisticated dude, but I found it interesting. And I guess one of the things I always found interesting about Mishima, even going back to school and reading him, and how he he grew up without a father. He grew up around, women that were always telling him how delicate he was. And I thought it was really cool to see the arc of his life of becoming this strong, athletic man point of view, from not just developing his artistic strength, but his physical and aesthetic strength as well. I feel like it's so rare in the culture that when we are presented gay characters, homosexual characters, it's almost never with the masculine bend and representation to it. But this is who Mishima really was. He loved the great physical art of the aesthetics of the Italian Renaissance, and had an appreciation for the human body, the human form, so much so that he became a bodybuilder. He again became a swordsman. And I thought it was cool how Schrader dealt with that. He really seemed to have a respect for it. Whereas I really wonder if this film was made today, how much of that care would be taken, because there seems to be sort of like this unwritten pressure that if you are dealing with a gay character, that you have to make statement after statement after statement after statement with them, as opposed to just writing a three-dimensional character that just happens to be this. And for Schrader to do that in the 80s, I think he deserves a lot of credit for that, because like when you mentioned at the top of the episode, that he's this sensitive poet and this homosexual, but then he's also sort of like this outspoken political person. We still see as the part of him being homosexual as being the weak, sensitive part of it. It's neither weak nor strong. It just kind of is. And the fact that Schrader didn't feel the need to, oh, homosexual means weak, or it means effete or feminine. It's like, no, it just was. And when you look at the portrayal of him, it seemed like his love of being a man and his love of men really was channeled through those sort of masculine endeavors of, again, sport, fitness, uniforms, bodybuilding. And
Yeah.
again, I find that to be really impressive and interesting, again, because we tend not to get that. It tends to be more, at least from my point of view, it tends to be what uneducated straight people see homosexuality or gay life as being, as opposed to actually digging into it. And Schrader clearly did his homework. So again, he deserves a lot of kudos for that, for sure.
Yeah, and that's something I certainly appreciate as well, being, outside of the LGBT community. Um, but someone who knows many people who are, and as someone who loves good stories, I
Right.
really appreciate approaching the subject matter with that type of nuance and sensitivity, and it's one of the many things that helps the film to, I think, really ring true for me. Mishima never ever comes across as any kind of stereotype. Neither
No.
like the kind of stereotypical effete and flamboyant gay man, but also he never really comes across as this really sort of repressed, like self-loathing gay person either. He kind of like accepts it, and it's just one piece of the larger puzzle of his entire life, and it's
Also, even even outside of his orientation, it was also kind of impressive to see how his politics were treated, as someone who was clearly a right winger within the world of Japanese politics. They were sort of presenting his position, which I don't even think conservatives clearly even conservatives in Japan of the time weren't on board with.
yeah.
Again, they could have completely, I mean, Schrader wouldn't do this, but it would have been very easy to sort of pigeonhole him as this wacky right winger, but at the same time, he took the care of the sympathy to the entire person, and it's like, okay, these are all of these things of him, of his politics, of his love life, of his artistry, were all just tended to with such care that at
Mhm.
no point, and no aspect of Mishima's life did it feel like things were being phoned in, that he was being treated less than, which could have been, I think, easy for maybe a lesser director. But at no point did Schrader ever do that. So again, it's even if you're not into these types of movies, I think it's a masterclass in how to really address the humanity of a historical figure, even if it's somebody. And I'm sure Schrader, didn't agree with a lot of what Mishima, stood for, but at the same time, still treating him as a human being that had a life and was really maneuvering the world in the only way that he knew how. And I think it's easy to sort of decry people and to judge them without having all of the information. And this film does a really great job of showing sort of like his shortcomings and his weaknesses based on how he grew up and when he grew up. Uh, Again, just overall amazing job done.
Yeah, and I think that is also a sign of, I think, a very a skilled writer, to be able to portray someone whose ideologies, you maybe you don't agree with and you don't sympathize with, but in a way that you can still sympathize with the person who believes that and why they believe it, even if you don't agree. And I think that, that is kind of, again, one of the movie's many strengths.
No, for sure. Something else too that kind of was popping into my head as I was watching it, in addition to it really being, again, it reminded me so much of these great Japanese films from the 70s. Again, the Lady Snowblood movie series, the Female Prisoner Scorpion film series, the Lone Wolf and Cub film series, again, that were all so beautifully crafted, aesthetically amazing, and fun to watch. I also harken back to the feels that I got from the work of Takeshi Kitano, who we discussed last episode. And Kitano is another one of those masters of, and in so much of his work, he addresses sort of the lonely man, the alienated man within Japanese, the man who is either too rough or too sensitive, or too rough because he's sensitive, because he's guarding himself from the world. And I just saw so many parallels between the characters that Kitano writes and performs and the real life of Mishima. And again, the great portrayal of him in this film. Again, I can't say that I've ever lived a very long time in Japanese society to know what it's like to be a Japanese man. But again, there's plenty of universals there, whether you're a man in Japan or the US or France. There's certain pressures and certain things you have to maneuver, and you can't always necessarily be sensitive or feel comfortable about sharing your feelings or your thoughts. And just watching these really great examples of how men maneuver the world, whether they're a Kitano character or they're someone like Mishima, just seeing these sort of repeated archetypes of these alienated men is it's kind of cool, because it's clearly not just an isolated thing, that these writers are capturing something that is real in the culture and putting it up on screen. And in no way is it ever exploitative. At no point is it ever, again, two-dimensional or one note. There is a three-dimensional human being there, and I think that's what pulls me into sort of these films. Again, they can be a bit fatalistic, they can be sad and or tragic, but it's the complexity of the character, it's the complexity of how all of this is presented, that I think is worth anyone watching. Because I don't know that we get enough of that today. You can't have, and not to say that I like flawed characters. I like complex characters. If the
Yeah.
complex character is flawed, completely heroic, that's great. But the complexity of character is something all of us, I think, can learn a lot from. Those of us, like you and I, that are screenwriters or people who just want an interesting film. Uh, the Mishima, A Life in Four Chapters, is absolutely worth your time. All the work of Paul Schrader is worth your time, as is the work of, again, people like Takeshi Kitano.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something I'm curious to some degree too, because I feel like there's a certain kind of masculine tone to a lot of Schrader's work. The focus is on a lot of these male characters. And so obviously, my view of it also comes from the perspective of a man. But I think, it's something which particularly resonates with me in that respect. But I feel like if you are a woman as well, there's still a lot to learn and appreciate from those characters, and particularly with Mishima. Mishima as a film, I think, again, because of how much nuance there is to Mishima the character, I think there's really a lot to appreciate for anyone.
Well, even and his female characters, the female characters in this film, which of course were family members and or lovers or confidants of Mishima, are also well crafted. While not all of them occupy the entire film, because again, it's done in 4 chapters, 4 moments, 4 eras within Mishima's life. He had very interesting, distinct women in his life. He was a very interesting, complex character, and everyone from his grandmother, to his female lovers were also really, not the run-of-the-mill type women, and they were fun to watch. They were, there is, I feel, more of a stereotypical portrayal of the Japanese woman in a lot of media, if you're not into Japanese film, of sort of this demure, doesn't seem to articulate a lot of opinions, doesn't seem to be as well formed, and you don't get any of that in this film. These women have a point of view. They have a particular way they navigate the world. They're interesting. Some of them are quite dark. Some of them are quite stronger than maybe what you would expect. And it's all great. I think nothing is sort of, there's no character in this film, and there's no characters in any of Schrader's films where, okay, and here comes a woman character who is really just a plot device to get our character to the next level. He doesn't do that here. There's no throwaway characters, and the women, I think, are as compelling as the male characters are. In fact, I would say the female characters in Mishima's life come off as far more interesting than Mishima's acolytes that end up, in his group. Like the acolytes, I mean, I can't even remember their names, if they even had names. But his grandmother, the woman that had the loan for the cafe, his lover, these different women that he was around were, again, really compelling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's all. Yeah, again, it ties into the broader theme of there being, just a lot of depth and nuance to all the characters that we see, and yeah, it's part of what makes the film, again, so interesting to me. One thing that I think is funny too is how, for as interesting as all those women are, we never see Mishima's wife at all. Like, he mentions her once.
No. That was an interesting choice, that we don't ever see her. We hear about her, but it's all of these other women that seem to figure much more strongly in his life than the woman he ended up marrying and having children with, which says a lot, and I'm sure it was intentional on the director. So, and that's something too. Is there's his presentation of masculinity and femininity are so much more nuanced and complex than I feel what we are getting maybe of late. There's certain things he doesn't have to describe. He doesn't spoon feed you. He doesn't try to appeal to your sense of stereotypes at all. And that just, again, it just makes for a way more interesting film.
Yes. Yeah. There you go.
No, please go ahead.
No, I didn't really have much there.
Oh, that's fine. No, I was just gonna, in terms of, films that, that sort of, what might be other films that, if somebody enjoyed something like this, is there anything that you'd recommend that are sort of in the vein of this film, or maybe tangentially similar to, that might pair well with something like this. Again, it's a singular interest. It's its own movie, and you're never going to find another one like this. But is there anything else, like if somebody wanted to dip into Paul Schrader, maybe they decided to start with Mishima, what would be maybe a good double bill or triple bill? Um,
Yeah, something I think, yeah, the obvious choice is again Taxi Driver. The similarities between Travis Bickle and Mishima are pretty obvious, and I
mhm.
mean, I don't need any excuse to recommend Taxi Driver. It's Taxi Driver. It's awesome. Maybe, yeah, I know you feel strongly about this, but I personally like First Reformed, and I think it matches the same themes of self-destruction, and this fatalism that you get with Mishima. And yeah, I would say those two probably are the ones where, if obviously both Taxi Driver and First Reformed are uh, kind of these downer movies, whereas Mishima, weirdly enough, I guess depending on your perspective, it has this very optimistic um, this very optimistic conclusion. It's this kind of big upbeat note along with Philip Glass's score, um, where it it casts Mishima's life and kind of the way that it ends in this very positive way, and it finds this beauty and this cohesion and clarity in Mishima's life. Whereas with First Reformed, and especially with Taxi Driver, there's the notion that Travis Bickle will continue to sink deeper into his psychosis. Whereas Mishima like makes it. He achieves not everything that he wants to, but the big things of gaining
No,
immortality,
that's a good point.
dying beautiful.
It's yeah, it does stand out in that way. And again, with Taxi Driver, again, if you haven't seen it, I don't want to spoil too much, but it's kind of open ended. First Reformed, the ending, it's kind of open ended. So I don't know that while there's a fatalism in them, the door is open for these characters to maybe turn a corner, possibly with Mishima, because he was a historical character and he obviously passed away in the 70s. We know where it's going. And in a weird, fatalistic way, again, to your point, he sort of achieves what he set out to do. Again, it wouldn't be anything that you or I or probably many people would do. But in so many ways, that blurred line between who he was in his life, in objective reality, and his ideal man of the samurai following the Budo, and a good death being the ultimate achievement for a samurai. He kind of achieves that without giving too much away. Again, I'm not spoiling the movie for you. He, in a weird fatalistic way, his life and his art eventually merged to become one. He
Mm-hmm.
fully integrated, no matter how sort of flawed I think it is. He sort of achieved what he wanted to do, and so in many ways, he's sort of you like you said, it's sort of like the not a happy ending, but it is definitely the goal was achieved in terms of all of the characters that Schrader's written. He's the one where okay, no, there's no open door of we know exactly where it's going, and there's that resolution, and that's that, and there's that ending. I think sure any of Schrader's films probably would pair well. Like you mentioned First Reformed, you mentioned Taxi Driver. um, First Reformed for me, I went in really what I was expecting and what I got were very different, and so I don't want to criticize Schrader too much because I think it's probably not probably it is a great film. It's not to my taste. I probably would rewatch Taxi Driver personally, but because you mentioned both of those, I am going to throw a wild card in there that just based on pure visuals, if you're someone who likes again a off the beaten path type of story, which Mishima certainly is because the guy's life was very much that. But one of my favorite Schrader films is Cat People from, I believe, 1983, which I remember being a kid and seeing the cardboard cutout, like this old video store where I was, they just kept old cutouts from like, and when movies would drop. And I remember seeing Natasha Kinski, who's the lead in Cat People, and it was sort of a cutout of her, sort of looking very sex kittenish. You know, it was sort of rain coming down on her, and I always thought that Cat People was some romantic film. And so, me as a kid and as a teenager, I was like, I don't want to watch that. That's not for me. And then a few years ago, I caught it on TV, and I could not believe I dismissed this film. And it's one of my favorite films, probably of all time. One of my favorite Schrader films for sure, because it is again so well crafted. It's not. It's actually a remake of a 1930s film, which I've also seen, also called Cat People. I think the remake is a million times better. It's set in Louisiana, in New Orleans. It is so unlike what I feel like the pressure today would be to put it in New York or to put it in LA, and they don't do that at all. But it's visually so stunning, the way it jumps between, sort of real life, like kitchen kitchen table talk, and then he'll throw in sort of these again fantastic sets, and he uses them sparingly. What's interesting, Mishima's more lavish with the set,
Mm.
obviously, but in Cat People, one, Natasha Kinski is one of the most aesthetically beautiful women I've ever seen in my life. I think she's one of the great women of screen, and
Yeah.
that's one reason you should watch the film, because she can have zero dialogue and just transfixed by her. And then occasionally we'll get like these glimpses of this other world within the real world. And looking back on that now, having watched Mishima, I feel like Schrader showed tremendous restraint in Cat People when he probably could have gone over the top if he wanted to. But the fact that he doesn't is what made that film even more fun to watch and interesting. But yeah, I would recommend Mishima, and I would recommend Cat People. If for nothing else, I've never had a group of guys watch Cat People and been upset about Natasha Kinski. So if Mishima is not your bag, I promise you, Cat People probably will be. But also, Taxi Driver. I can't recommend First Reform too much because it is so heavy. I think it is. I think it is the heaviest film that Schrader's done, and so that's a hard one for me to recommend. But Taxi Driver, Cat People, for sure on that one.
Yeah, I would say also there are a few other films where the production design was done by the production designer for this movie, Eiko Ishioka. Something she did the Francis Ford Coppola Dracula movie, and as well
Mm.
as two other movies that came out in the early 2000s called The Cell and The Fall, which have these kind of again very highly stylized and kind of colorful and unusual production design that I think is really cool. Something else also that I saw recently too would maybe be Beau is Afraid, which also kind of leans into these, kind of like large, elaborate set pieces, and this, they create this kind of surreal and otherworldly world that we kind of get within Mishima as well. So those are
Mm.
probably things that I would plug too.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, I like movies that are not afraid to almost kind of become a little bit dreamlike. I think it grabs your attention, and it's again it elevates the character. And yeah, that's just me. Yeah, so I certainly, everything that we mentioned, certainly the other Schrader films, I think, pair well, but also again these other Japanese films like the early, at least Violent Cop and Boiling Point, and I've mentioned those two before, by Takeshi Kitano, both worth watching. Oh, and might pair well with Mishima. I didn't. What was I going to mention? Oh yeah, Mishima, A Life in Four Parts, is available right now on Criterion Channel. If you're not subscribed to CriterionChannel.com, you're missing out. I think it is probably one of my most viewed streamers of all the streamers that I subscribe to. I watch a lot of Criterion Channel. Just the depth and breadth of international cinema, classic film, cult film, art house film, shorts, there's just so much great stuff on there that you could easily get lost. And again, if you're bored with film, or you can't find anything in your theater or anything to rent right now, I highly recommend watching or getting on Criterion Channel. You've got stuff like Mishima, you've got Ghost Dog, Way of the Samurai, you've got Les Samurai. I know I'm mentioning all these samurai films, but yeah, there's a lot of great stuff out there. Whether you're a guy who likes action and lone wolf characters, or you like stuff that's a little more arty, great stuff out there. So again, yeah, big props to Criterion Channel. And they're constantly programming too, every month or something. I think right now it's November Noir. Last month they had art house horror, 90s horror. They put together really great stuff. So any month you hop in, there's going to be something fun to watch. And no, I'm not getting paid by Criterion Channel to push it. It's just one of my favorites, and they never let me down. So
yeah, big ups for Criterion always.
For sure. But yeah, I guess we could wrap it there. But thank you for recommending this to me. I really had no idea what I was in for. When you said, "Have I seen Mishima?" Again, had no idea Schrader directed it. And again, if I had gone into this movie not knowing who directed it, I would have assumed it was. I mean, it could have been a Kurosawa film, for all I knew. It's just that well done. So thank you again for that recommendation. And yeah, just keep it coming, man. If there's anything like that, send it my way, and we'll check it out. I think now it'll be fun to dig into, obviously, this other Japanese cinema, but I really also want to tackle Tarkovsky with you, and also Fassbender, because I don't really have a lot of people around me at the moment that are interested in these two guys. And there are legends within people that are cinephiles and people that are, cinema lovers, and people who are screenwriters. But I feel like they're not as well known outside of that. And it would be fun to sort of bring these guys out, and maybe that'll be the next project. We'll tackle some of these features, because I feel like Tarkovsky's stuff, like Stalker, Solaris, those are pretty well known, but I don't know that people know his other films. And certainly, there's a lot of stuff that people should know about Fassbender that maybe we could approach, if you're cool with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in my opinion, Tarkovsky is the GOAT. And I love his movies, and I would love to talk about them. But before we get me started, that's we can save that one for for another episode. We'll be here in a couple hours.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, we've got a jet. But thank you all for watching. And again, check out Mishima, check out Criterion Channel, check out the works of Paul Schrader, Takeshi Kitano. And yeah, until next time, thank you guys.
All right.